Okay, hello. So this is part 7 in my Tara series, and today we're going to go through detecting reasoning errors. In the previous video, we went through assessing the impact of additional information. So if you've not seen that already, I would highly recommend you to do so. And that being said, let's get into it. So with detecting reasoning errors, these questions essentially are asking you to spot what is wrong with an argument, and the argument would normally contain a flaw in the way it moves from its evidence to its conclusion. So, keeping that in mind, you are not assessing whether the reasons are correct or not. You're assessing what was wrong mapping the reasons to the conclusion. So, to actually go and identify what the flaw is, you need to actually know what the conclusion is. So, obviously, finding a conclusion is quite easy, just finding the gist of the passage essentially, and also finding the reasons that support it, and then asking whether the conclusion actually follows. So do look out for things that are quite unsupported, like assumptions, jumping to conclusions, irrelevant information, or even confusing correlation with causation, which is quite a big issue. And also remember that you're looking for an error in the reasoning, not something that you disagree with or find factually wrong. So yeah, conclusion, reasons, what's the logical gap essentially? So if we look at my example, Tom got a bad mark in his first maths test. Therefore, Tom will fail his maths test. Which one of the following best identifies the error in the reasoning? A. The argument assumes that one bad result guarantees failure in the final exam. B. The argument does not tell us what subject Tom's exam is in. C. The argument assumes Tom has taken a maths test before. D. The argument does not tell us how much Tom studied. Or E. The argument assumes Tom dislikes mathematics. Wow, there's a lot of spelling errors on that thing. But anyways, so if you cannot tell already, the answer is A, Tom, because the evidence in the passage is that Tom got one bad mark, and that the conclusion is that he would fail his exam, which is quite a big jump. One bad mark does not mean final failure. So the problem is that the poor result does not establish that he'll fail in future exams. There's no other further reasoning for it, and so it makes an unjustified leap from one piece of evidence to like a definitive prediction. So if we look at the other options, for B, if we cannot do it because we're literally told that it's a maths exam, so the subject is quite clear, so that's incorrect. And with C, whether it's his first maths test, that makes no difference. And with D, knowing how much he actually studied mm, could provide you some useful context, but its absence isn't necessarily the reasoning error. And with E, his feelings towards maths has no impact on the conclusion. So just look for why the reason does not follow and the information that is missing. And going on to our actual example, this is from the TSA paper and is question 9. And let's read it together. So, membership of the European Union has resulted in the maintenance of economic growth and political stability for the countries that make it up. It is desirable that the countries that used to be part of the communist Eastern Bloc become comparably prosperous and stable. Therefore, the European Union should be enlarged as soon as possible to include more Eastern Bloc countries. This argument is flawed. Which of the following identifies an error in its reasoning? A. It assumes that the Eastern Bloc countries have potential for growth and stability than the existing members had prior to entry. B. It fails to acknowledge that there are countries outside the EU that are just as prosperous and stable. C. It relies on there being no opposition to the enlargement of the EU from existing member countries. D. It assumes that the exclusion of the Eastern Bloc countries from the EU would result in their being unstable. And E, it assumes that the success of a political affiliation like the EU can be measured in purely economic terms. So, if you could not tell already, we need to go and break it down because the passage is quite long. So, if we look, we could tell that there's two premises and a conclusion essentially. So the first premise is that the EU has brought growth and stability to its existing members. The second premise is that Eastern Bloc countries need prosperity and stability, and we can conclude that the EU should admit Eastern Bloc countries immediately. So if you cannot tell already, the correct answer is option A, because the argument assumes a direct causal transfer and it assumes that what worked for one group will work for another group. So it ignores the baseline differences between regions. So option A exposes this underlying assumption, which is why it's important to watch previous videos, because underlying assumptions do appear in other really tricky parts of the critical thinking section. So yeah. So why can it not be the other options? I hear you asking. So it cannot be B because, quite frankly, it's irrelevant to the specific mechanism of expansion. With C, it focuses on political hurdles rather than the actual logical link. D misinterprets the argument as being an exclusive threat, and E is false because the prompt explicitly mentions political stability. So just general method of identifying four questions: find a conclusion first, then find supporting premises and spot a logical gap. That's also quite important, as well as common fallacies between correlations and causations. That's one of the tricks that they use a lot in previous past papers. And also eliminating true but irrelevant options, because some can be considered true, but they're not really answering the question and the conclusion that the passage has. But yes, that's that for that question. So in the next video, we're going to go through matching arguments. So I'll see you there. Bye bye.